More on our top story now. The South African economy grew in the second quarter of this year. Data from Stats SA shows gross domestic product increased by 0.4% following a revised 0% growth in the first quarter. 7 out of 10 industries recorded positive growth between the first and the second quarter. For more on this, I'm joined by Professor Raymond Parsons from the Northwest University Business School Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences. A very good afternoon, Professor. Thank you very much for joining us. So what's your reading of the latest GDP print and how its various constituents performed?
Yes, good afternoon to you. Look, it's good to have a smile on one's face instead of a frown about our growth outlook, because quite clearly even a 0.4%, while very modest, nonetheless is better than the zero growth that we registered in the first quarter. So there are really two things here. Firstly, this is better news on the growth front. And secondly, it fits into our commitment as a country, as a government, as business, for higher, inclusive, job-rich growth. We're not there yet, and quite clearly there's still quite a tough road ahead. But the fact is, we seem to be, if we take these numbers at their face value, it seems to me that we're at a turning point in our economy, that our business cycle will now start to turn up instead of flatlining. And that's the challenge, because quite clearly there are things we need to do as a country if we want to ensure that we build on this better news on the growth front.
Yes. So, of course, there was some good news and some bad news. The finance sector contributed positively, trade contributed positively. But then on the downside, for example, mining recording yet another contraction in the second quarter. That sector has really struggled. And, of course, it continues to be quite a fundamental part of the South African economy.
Well, yes, you see, as you unpack these growth figures, there are the leaders and there are the laggards, for various reasons. I would identify two other weak links that we will need to give very special attention to. If you look at the capital investment, that figure is negative, and that's where the future growth has to come from in the longer term. We want both the public and the private sector to expedite their infrastructural plans or their investment plans so that we can get the job-rich growth that we want. And secondly, exports. Also, there was a negative figure there, maybe a temporary experience, but it comes back to the important point we keep making, that we want to be globally competitive. And that's very important for our future growth and our future job creation. So over and above the positive trends, those are two weak links from a policy point of view that we do need to give very special attention, because you want the growth to be higher and be sustained and be job rich. And that means we've got to build on these numbers and not be complacent. We mustn't assume that the economy is on cruise control. It's not.
Absolutely.
We're going to have to drive it upward to where it's got to be.
Yeah. So the consumption side of the GDP number is said to have positively contributed to the latest GDP print. How is the consumer faring? And presumably, if those interest rate cuts that we keep on talking about do come through, that should actually paint a brighter picture for the consumer.
Yes, well, I think that all households have gone through a difficult period. Fortunately, if we look at these numbers, they've been positive and they've made a major contribution towards the fact that we did grow at 0.4% in the second quarter. But this needs also to be underpinned. It needs to be underpinned by the fact that we will be growing the economy, which means that real wages could grow with the economy, but also in particular to the extent that the costs of borrowing have impacted on consumers and on business. Fortunately, all the omens are that later this month we will see a commencement in the reduction of the interest rate cycle, because on the back of the fact that we have less inflation now in South Africa, we can feel confident that from now on interest rates will begin at a certain pace to come down over the months ahead. And this will, of course, be good for consumer confidence.
So, Professor, what's your sense around how the country is doing in terms of the reform agenda and the implementation thereof? Because obviously we can't be satisfied with an average annual growth of 1%, because that can't go any distance in terms of addressing our socio-economic woes.
Well, that's tremendously important, and it really is the theme that we should all take away, or the message we should all take away from these particular growth figures. There is still a road ahead that we need to walk. We need to ensure that both the government and the private sector are united in the reforms that they need to implement. I think particularly of the work being done between business and government in the field of energy, where there's still unfinished business, although load shedding has receded, the issues in transport and, of course, logistics, and the issue of crime, which has reasserted itself as a very important factor in the optics of our economy. If we play our cards correctly, and if we implement what we've said we will do, I can see, well, on the present numbers, we may grow at about 1% in GDP this year. We can push it up to 2% next year, and perhaps to 3% in 2026. That is the promise that these figures hold out if we build on them by acting and reforming what we've said we will do. And this is not only a responsibility of course, on the government, which needs to create the right environment, needs to do the decisions and the choices it needs to make, but also that it mobilizes the private sector. Because one of the big challenges we've seen in recent years is that if you can mobilize the private sector, you can get more things done a lot sooner.
Indeed, indeed. Professor Parsons, thank you so much for your insights, sir. And thank you very much for talking to us today. That was Professor Raymond Parsons. He's from the Northwest University Business School, giving us his insights there on GDP.